The unit patch was rough between her fingers, worn soft by 18 years of touching it before every shift. Natalie Hayes stood in the staff bathroom at St. Michael's ICU, door locked, jacket unzipped just enough to reach the faded insignia sewn inside the lining. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Her fingers traced the embroidered border, gold thread now silver with age, and she pressed it flat against her ribs like a prayer. Outside, the fluorescent lights hummed their endless fluorescent song, and somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm into the pre-dawn quiet. She had not worn a uniform in 9 years. The Pentagon had been very clear about that. Captain Natalie Hayes had died in Baghdad along with the rest of her life, and what walked out of that Black Ops extraction was someone else entirely. Someone smaller. Someone who counted pills instead of counting casualties. Someone who moved through hospitals like a whisper, like a ghost that other people forgot the moment they stopped looking at her. She zipped her jacket, took the route through the supply closet to avoid the morning briefing, and stepped into the ICU at 05 for 7 hours. The shift was already breathing, that specific rhythm of night shift bleeding into morning shift, of nurses finishing charting while doctors arrived with their fresh coffee and their fresh certainties. The antiseptic smell was overwhelming as always, sharp enough to cut, and underneath it the faint copper-sweet scent of blood from the trauma bays 2 floors down. Natalie moved to the med cart without speaking to anyone. The cart sat in its usual place near the station, and she began her count with the precision of someone who had once inventoried ammunition in a supply depot. 10 milliliters morphine. 8 milligrams ondansetron. 4 ampules of epinephrine. The numbers lined up like soldiers. Her hands moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing something 1,000 times, maybe 10,000 times, and her eyes never wavered from the inventory sheet. This was meditation. This was the only place her mind went quiet. Dr. Pierce appeared beside her without speaking first. She felt him before she heard him, that specific pressure change that came from someone who took up space deliberately, who moved through rooms like he owned them. He stood maybe 3 feet away, watching her count, and his breathing carried the sharp smell of expensive coffee and something else underneath it. Cologne, expensive, the kind that cost more than her hourly wage times 40 hours. He was still in his coat, the fabric of buttersoft wool that probably had a price tag she didn't want to know about, and his shoes were Italian leather with a shine that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. Tedious work, he said finally, his voice carrying that particular inflection doctors used when they were talking about nurses in front of nurses, as if the person in question had suddenly become invisible. I suppose precision matters when you're counting pills. Lower stakes than actual medicine. Natalie did not look up. Her fingers continued their movement across the ampules, and she turned the page on her clipboard without missing a beat. 10 ampules epinephrine. Check. She had learned long ago that silence was a kind of response too. Silence meant she did not accept the premise. Silence meant she did not flinch. Pierce waited for her to respond, his jaw working slightly, and when she did not, he made a small sound, something between a dismissal and a snort, and moved toward the station. Natalie could feel his irritation like heat. He did not like being ignored. Most people who carried his kind of power did not. But she had stood in front of people who could decide whether she lived or died with a single radio transmission, and Dr. Pierce, for all his tailored wool and his Italian shoes, was not one of those people. The ICU settled into its morning rhythm. Natalie finished the med cart count at 0603 hours and moved through the unit on her floor rounds, checking lines and listening to breath sounds and reading the monitors with the kind of attention that made the numbers sing. Room 1 was stable, post-op cardiac patient, pressures climbing slowly toward normal. Room 2 was improving, the sepsis line showing early response to antibiotics. Room 3 was unchanged, which meant unchanged was good. Room 4 was where her hands moved differently, where something in her chest shifted the moment she pushed open the door. Captain James Rhett lay sedated in room 4, his body pale against the white sheets, lines running into both arms and one line disappearing beneath his shirt toward his subclavian line. His vitals were on the monitors behind the bed, a steady parade of numbers that told a story in green phosphorescence, heart rate 96, blood pressure 114/68, O2 sat 94 on 2 liters, breathing at a rate of 14. Good numbers. Numbers that meant he was still here. Still fighting at a cellular level even while the medication kept him unconscious. But the tattoo on his right forearm was what made her pause. She saw it as soon as she lifted his arm to check the foresight, a small emblem, about the size of a dime, the same insignia as the unit patch in her jacket lining. Same unit. Same battalion. Same Dark Horse patch that her son had worn on his uniform before the IED in Sanjin Valley took him. Before the notification officers showed up at her door in 2016 wearing their dress uniforms and their careful expressions and their carefully rehearsed words. Natalie's hands did not shake. Her breathing did not change. But something in her chest unlocked like a door opening onto a hallway she had been carefully not walking down for 8 years. She checked his lines with focused precision. The central line was patent, no signs of infection at the insertion site. The arterial line was reading accurately, the waveform smooth and synchronized with his heartbeat. His Foley catheter was patent, output adequate. Everything the monitors told her matched what her hands confirmed when she touched him, stable, sedated, slowly deteriorating from whatever had brought him here, but not in crisis. Not yet. She looked at the chart. Captain James Rhett, United States Navy, age 56, admitted from the field with pneumonia complicated by sepsis and an aortic dissection they were monitoring. The dissection was small for now. Small meant it might not expand. Small meant he might live if the antibiotics worked. Small meant she would be checking his vitals every 30 minutes, like a religious practice, and listening to his lungs and watching his pressures and whispering prayers to God she had stopped believing in a long time ago. She touched the unit patch through her jacket, fingers pressing against the embroidered gold, and then she checked the monitor one more time. Heart rate steady. Sinus rhythm. Good. When she turned to leave the room, Pierce was standing in the doorway. He had a way of materializing that made her wonder if he practiced it, if he stood in front of mirrors learning how to appear in doorways in that specific way, arms crossed, posture exactly positioned to take up as much space as possible, face arranged into an expression that sat somewhere between concern and contempt. Behind him, she could see the nursing station, could see the other nurses glancing away and suddenly very interested in their computer screens. Spending a lot of time with this patient, Pierce observed. His voice was conversational, which somehow made it worse. Conversational implied he was just thinking out loud. Conversational meant he was building something. Checking vitals, Natalie said. The words came out neutral, professional. Just a nurse doing her job. Just a nurse who knew that this man controlled her schedule, her assignment preferences, her ability to request certain shifts. Just a nurse who had learned how to be invisible in front of people who had power. I'm aware of your duties, Pierce said. What I'm questioning is whether you should be the one doing them. Captain Rhett deserves a nurse with advanced critical care certification. You have an RN license and some on-the-job experience. There's a difference. The hallway air seemed to thicken. Natalie moved toward the door, and Pierce did not step aside, so she had to angle her body to get past him, and as she did, his shoulder bumped into her deliberately, not quite hard enough to call it a push, but hard enough that it was not an accident. Hard enough that everyone watching would see it happen and also know that it had been on purpose. She kept walking. But what they didn't know, what Pierce didn't know, was that she had survived much worse than shoulder checks and contemptuous glances. She had survived 17 firefights and 4 IED detonations and a night in the Hindu Kush with a sucking chest wound and nothing but a combat knife and a prayer. She had survived the extraction that had cost her name and her rank and her entire previous life. A man in Italian shoes bumping her in a hallway was barely worth the energy it took to breathe. At 1,130 hours, during her break, Natalie went to the vending machine on the 3rd floor. It was deliberate. This machine was far enough away from the ICU that she would not run into Pierce, far enough away that she could stand alone for 3 minutes and breathe air that did not taste like antiseptic. She had paid for a coffee, black, no sugar, because sweetness felt like a betrayal of something, when Pierce rounded the corner with a surgical resident in tow, young and eager and already learning how to stand the way Pierce stood, how to move through space like it had been purchased specifically for him. Pierce did not slow down. He did not acknowledge her. He simply shoulder-checked her again, harder this time, hard enough that the coffee cup fell from her hand and hit the floor and sent a wave of dark liquid across the tile like spilled blood. The surgical resident looked horrified, then looked at Pierce to see what the protocol was. Pierce kept walking. "My apologies," Natalie said quietly, reaching for paper towels. The words came out deferential, exactly the way Pierce wanted them to come out. Just a nurse who had dropped her coffee. Just a clumsy nurse who was in the way. Just a nurse who needed to learn her place. But Pierce turned back. He turned back and walked toward her with that same easy confidence, and he leaned against the vending machine like he had all the time in the world, and he smiled. Not a real smile. A smile that showed teeth, like a warning. "If you understand that," he said quietly, "then you also understand that I don't want you within 10 feet of Captain Rhett unless another nurse is present. Is that clear? I can have you reassigned. I can have you suspended pending a board review. I can make one phone call and your nursing license becomes a lot less valuable. So when I ask if that's clear, I need you to understand that I am not asking casually." Natalie looked at him. She had been trained to read hostile intent in a tenth of a second, trained to assess threat levels with the kind of intuition that came from staying alive in places where hesitation meant death. She looked at this man in his wool coat and his Italian shoes and his visible certainty that the world bent to his will, and she said nothing at all. She simply returned to the ICU. And at 1,200 hours, when she was supposed to be on break, she was checking Captain Rhett's vitals instead, her hands moving through their practiced routine, temperature normal, blood pressure holding at 110/65, heart rate climbing slightly at 102, something beginning to shift in the sedated man's body that the monitors had not yet flagged, but her hands could feel in the way he was holding tension in his muscles. Something was beginning. Something was coming. She touched the unit patch one more time, and then she settled into her vigil, checking every 30 minutes like a prayer, like a promise to a dead son that she would save this man if it meant breaking every rule that had ever been written about what nurses were supposed to do. The fluorescent lights of the ICU conference room hummed at a frequency that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. Natalie Hayes had learned not to listen. At 0800 on Tuesday morning, 20 physicians filed into the space, attending surgeons, cardiologists, infectious disease specialists, fellows in their pressed white coats that looked like they'd never seen actual blood. Dr. Pierce stood at the front of the room beside a wall of imaging screens, his silver cufflinks catching the light as he gestured toward a patient file. He moved like a man who had never been contradicted. 63-year-old male, admitted with acute coronary syndrome, Pierce announced, his voice carrying the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Presented with substernal chest pain radiating to the left arm. EKG shows ST elevation in leads 2, 3, AVF. He clicked to the next slide. Cardiac catheterization revealed 95% occlusion of the right coronary artery. We managed with a stent placement. Straightforward case. Textbook interventional cardiology. One of the cardiologists nodded. Another made a note on her tablet. Natalie stood at the medication cart along the far wall, counting 0.5 milligram doses of lorazepam into the unit's weekly supply, her movements precise and unhurried. She had learned years ago that being invisible in rooms like this was a survival skill. Pierce loved these rounds, loved the audience, loved the performance of his own competence. He would work through 5 or 6 cases, each one presented with the same casual mastery, each one a small demonstration of his superiority over the lesser intellects in the room. Then he paused. He looked directly at her. "Nurse Hayes," he said, and the tone of his voice shifted. It became something sharper, something with an edge. "Would you join us for a moment?" Natalie replaced the medication bottle in the locked cabinet with deliberate care. She turned from the cart without rushing, without the hesitation that might have suggested nervousness. 20 pairs of eyes tracked her movement across the room. Doctors at grand rounds were like predators that could smell uncertainty. She had learned that lesson too. This, Pierce said, gesturing toward her as if she were a specimen under glass, is what happens when we lower our standards in nursing. This is Nurse Hayes. She has been with us for approximately 18 months. During that time, she has made several medication errors, questioned physician orders on multiple occasions, and exhibited behavior that I would characterize as erratic and concerning. He turned back to the assembled doctors. This is what happens when we allow nurses who think watching YouTube videos qualifies them for clinical judgment to operate in critical care environments. Someone laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that cut through the recirculated air like a scalpel. Natalie stood perfectly still. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the slightest tension at the angle where bone met muscle, visible only if you knew where to look, and Pierce was not the kind of man who looked carefully at anyone beneath him. Her hands hung at her sides. Her breathing remained even. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere beyond Pierce's right shoulder, as if he occupied less space than he actually did. "Tell us, Nurse Hayes," Pierce continued, warming to his theme the way a man warms to any performance that generates applause. "Where exactly did you receive your medical education? The School of Hard Knocks, perhaps?" Laughter rippled through the room like a current. Someone whispered something to the resident beside them. Another doctor's shoulders shook with silent amusement. Pierce smiled, a thin, satisfied expression that made the fluorescent lighting cast shadows under his eyes. Natalie said nothing. She remained standing, her expression blank as drywall, her posture unchanged. Not a muscle moved in her face. Not a tremor in her hands. After approximately 30 seconds of silence, during which Pierce's smile began to falter slightly at the edges, she turned and walked back to the medication cart. She took her seat only when Pierce, uncertain how to proceed, gestured dismissively with his hand. The rounds continued. By 09:30, the doctors had dispersed back to their various departments, their various levels of importance and specialization, and the ICU returned to its normal rhythm of alarms and ventilators and the soft whoosh of pneumatic doors opening and closing. Natalie returned to her assigned patients. Room 2 needed labs drawn. Room 6 vasopressor infusion needed adjustment. Room 4, the room with the Navy captain whose forearm bore the same insignia as the unit patch sewn inside her jacket, required vital signs every 30 minutes, and she had not missed a single check. What they didn't know was that she had already counted every white coat in that conference room. 20 physicians. 20 refusals would come later, but for now, there were 20 potential obstacles, 20 sources of power, 20 people who believed that credentials were more important than competence. By 1400 that afternoon, the rumors had already begun their work. Natalie overheard 2 residents in the hallway outside the medication room, their voices low enough that they might have believed she couldn't hear them through the closed door. "YouTube nurse," one of them said. Pierce mentioned something about medication errors. The other resident, a woman in her second year of training whose name Natalie had never bothered to learn, laughed in a way that suggested this information confirmed something she had always suspected about people like Natalie. People without the right pedigree. People who had learned medicine in locations other than university hospitals and lecture halls. Natalie selected a 100-unit insulin syringe from the cabinet and did not allow her breathing to change. At 16:30, Pierce found her at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, a location far enough from the ICU that he could speak to her without an audience, which somehow made the confrontation worse. He was holding a coffee in a white ceramic cup from the hospital cafeteria, and his expression suggested he had been thinking about this conversation for some time. He moved toward her with his shoulder slightly angled. The shoulder check came with enough force to slop coffee across her scrubs, the dark liquid spreading like a continent across her left upper arm. The cup itself didn't fall, but it was close. He had calculated it precisely. Not so hard that it would look like an outright attack if anyone had been watching, but hard enough that she would lose her balance, hard enough that she would be reminded of his physical presence and his power to use it. Natalie bent down to clean the spill, pulling paper towels from the dispenser near the machine with steady fingers. Her scrubs were washable. Coffee was washable. Some things left marks and some things didn't. Pierce leaned against the machine, positioning his body between her and the exit. His voice came out low and controlled, the voice of a man who knew exactly how to apply pressure without leaving bruises. You represent everything wrong with modern medicine, Nurse Hayes. Competence without credentials. Respect without earning it. I'm watching you. I have been watching you since you arrived at St. Michael's, and I will continue watching you. He paused. Keep testing me. Keep overstepping. Give me one more reason. One more incident. And I will personally escort you to security and watch them walk you out the door. Natalie straightened. She met his eyes with the expression of someone looking at a wall. No anger. No fear. No emotion of any kind. She had been trained by people who understood that revealing your thoughts in your face was a tactical vulnerability. She had survived Baghdad, survived the extraction that had gone wrong, survived the Pentagon's decision to erase her records and order her to disappear into civilian life. She could survive this man and his coffee and his certainty that he mattered more than she did. She stepped past him toward the elevator without responding. I said, learn your place, he called after her, his voice louder now, stung by her silence in a way that his silence had not stung her. By 1900, Pierce had made his calls. 3 phone calls to the nursing director, each one planting a seed. I'm concerned about Natalie Hayes. Several physicians have mentioned medication errors. Her clinical judgment seems compromised. We should be documenting these incidents. The calls were brief. The implications were enormous. By the time Natalie returned to her assigned station, the director had scheduled a formal meeting for the following morning. Nothing official yet. Nothing that would show up on paper. Just a conversation. Just a chance to discuss concerns. She read the email on her phone while standing in the supply closet, surrounded by 4 bags and sterile gauze and the smell of antiseptic that never quite washed away no matter how many years you worked in hospitals. Her hands did not shake as she read it. Her throat did not tighten. But in that small, enclosed space with only stainless steel shelving and boxes of equipment as witness, she pressed her palm flat against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. The darkness behind her eyelids was temporary. The badge she wore was temporary. The position she held was temporary. All of it was temporary, and everything that mattered was permanent: the unit patch inside her jacket lining, the memory of her son's face, the weight of the promise she had made to a man dying in room for who had commanded the unit her son had died serving. She opened her eyes. She returned to work. She checked Captain Rhett's vitals at 1930 and again at 2000, her hands moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Blood pressure 98/60 and dropping. Heart rate climbing. The skin cool and clammy. She documented everything with meticulous care. She made no notes about what she suspected. She simply recorded what the machines told her, the numbers, the vital signs, the slow deterioration of a man whose aorta was becoming undone at the molecular level, one failing cell at a time. At 2100, she touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. The same insignia. The same unit. The same weight of obligation that had followed her from Baghdad to Atlanta and would follow her until one of 2 outcomes occurred: either she saved this man, or she watched him die knowing she could have done something and had been prevented by 20 physicians and 1 doctor with silver cufflinks and absolute certainty that hierarchy was more important than survival. Room 4's monitor beeped its steady rhythm, a sound like a countdown, like a clock, like something running out of time. The monitor alarm screamed at 0200. 3 short bleeps, then silence, then 3 more. Natalie's eyes snapped open before the second tone finished, not from sleep, because she hadn't slept, just sat in the break room with cold coffee and her hand pressed against the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining. The alarm was different this time. Not the steady beep of distress. This was the sound of a body shutting down. She moved before thinking. Muscle memory from another life, another uniform, another room where the monitors sounded exactly like this. Captain Rhett's door was 6 steps from where she stood. She covered the distance in 4. His color was wrong. Grey-blue at the lips, abdomen distended like water trapped beneath the skin. His pressure was dropping, she could see it on the monitor before she even reached the bed. 120. Now 108. The numbers falling like a man dropping through water. His eyes were open but unfocused, the way a person's eyes looked when the body was already beginning its final negotiation with physics. She assessed the situation the way she'd assessed casualties in the streets of Fallujah. Quick. Clinical. Without the luxury of emotion. Aortic rupture. The signs were written across his body in the language she'd learned to read when she was still Captain Hayes, when she was still someone with a name that appeared in official records instead of someone who had been erased, ordered into civilian life, told to disappear. Internal bleeding. Massive. His abdomen was rigid, distended, the tissue filling with blood that should have been carrying oxygen to his organs. Blood pressure 96 and falling. His heart rate climbing to compensate, 138 beats per minute, a frantic rhythm like something trying to escape its own cage. 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if he was lucky. After that, organ failure. Irreversible. Death written in blood chemistry and cellular decay. She pressed the call button. Once. Twice. Her voice on the intercom was steady, even, the voice of someone reporting a weather update, code trauma, room 4. Acute aortic syndrome. Need all available surgeons. Now. They came. All 20 of them, the on-call physicians who had laughed at her 2 hours earlier in the lounge, who had called her inadequate, who had built their entire empire on the assumption that a nurse was something less than capable. 20 white coats flowing into the ICU like water finding cracks. She watched their faces register the monitor, the numbers, the expanding abdomen of a dying man. And then she watched them stop. Dr. Pierce arrived behind them, silver cufflinks catching the fluorescent light. He looked at the monitor, looked at Captain Rhett, looked at Natalie with something like satisfaction spreading across his face. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, crisis, chaos, a moment where hierarchy would matter more than competence. Nobody touches this patient without my explicit authorization, Pierce said. His voice filled the room the way a poison fills water. Slowly. Inevitably. This is an 8% survival rate case. 8%. Do you understand what that means? It means the families will sue. It means the hospital will pay. It means we follow protocol. His pressure is dropping, Natalie said. Her voice was quiet. That was her power, not volume, but the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst that war could offer. He needs intervention. Now. He needs a comfort care discussion with his family, Pierce said. He needs us to acknowledge that some patients are beyond our scope. This is triage. This is medicine. This is refusal, Natalie said. Pierce turned to the gathered physicians. All of you, I need documentation. I need each of you on record that you concur with my assessment. Aggressive intervention is not indicated. The liability exposure is catastrophic. The family will be notified of comfort care options. The patient will be made comfortable as he passes. One by one, they nodded. One by one, they signed off in the chart. Dr. Melton, the interventional radiologist, gone, walking down the hallway toward the stairwell. Dr. Cho, the trauma surgeon, gone, heading toward the elevators. Dr. Lakshmi from cardiothoracic, gone. Then Patel, then Williams, then Gonzalez. 19. 20. Natalie counted each white coat that disappeared, timing their exodus the way you time a countdown. 1 coat every 8 seconds. By 02:15, the hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Captain Rhett's pressure was 84/42. Pierce leaned close to her, his voice dropping to something worse than a shout because it was measured, reasonable, the voice of someone absolutely certain of his authority. You will not interfere with physician decisions. You will not perform any procedures. You will document that the patient was presented with comfort care options and maintain his dignity as he declines. "Do you understand me, Ms. Hayes?" She didn't answer. She was watching the monitor. 82/40. His oxygen saturation dropping. 78%. The kind of number that meant the cells were beginning to die, one by one, organs staging their own small mutinies. 76%. Pierce walked out. He was gone by 02:20. Natalie stood outside room 4 at 0230 and made her decision. Not the kind of decision that required debate or committee meetings or consultation with ethics boards. The kind of decision that had only two outcomes: act or let him die. She had made this decision before. In Baghdad. In a village called Sanjin Valley. In 100 dark places where the Pentagon had sent her and her unit, where she had learned that the difference between a live human and a dead human sometimes came down to 30 seconds and a blade and the willingness to act when everyone else had already walked away. She moved like someone turning a key in a lock. Precise. Deliberate. She locked the ICU door and returned to room 4. From her ankle sheath, the one hidden beneath her scrub pants, the one Pierce had never looked close enough to see, she pulled the combat knife. 8 inches of steel, the blade darkened from blood that would never fully wash away, the same knife she had used for field thoracotomies in Baghdad when she was still Captain Natalie Hayes, when she was still alive instead of erased, when she was still part of a world that made sense instead of one that had ordered her to disappear. Her hands prepared the sterile field. They didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint. It was the sound of something dangerous being held behind bone and sinew and 30 years of discipline. She opened the crash cart and found what she needed: the defibrillator pads, the suction tube, the gauze. Her hands moved on their own, the way they had moved in desert heat and Arctic cold and every temperature of human suffering in between. She positioned the knife at the 5th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. The location where she had made this incision 4 times before. The location where the human body keeps its secrets and its survival in equal measure. Captain Rhett's eyes were still open. She met them for exactly 1 second. "You're going to feel pressure," she said. "Not pain. Pressure. The difference matters." She made the incision. The blade moved through skin and fascia like water finding its path. The sound was small, a whisper of tissue parting, but the blood that followed was immediate, thick, the color of engine oil. She suctioned. Found the bleeder. Her fingers located the aorta through the opening, felt the rupture through the thin wall of the vessel. She had felt this before. The particular desperation of a blood vessel trying to hold itself together. Her hands didn't ask permission from her brain. They simply moved. 37 years of her life compressed into muscle memory and instinct. She applied pressure to the rupture site. The bleeding slowed. Then stopped. Captain Rhett's monitor, which had been screaming at him to hurry toward death, began to normalize. His pressure climbed. 90/50. 102/60. His oxygen saturation rose like a prayer being answered. 82%. 86%. The numbers becoming numbers again instead of omens. She worked for 47 minutes. When she was finished, the bleeding had stopped, the vital organs were perfusing, and Captain James Rhett was alive in a way that the 20 physicians had already decided was impossible. She sutured with hands that had stopped trembling years ago on a battlefield in a country that had erased her from every official record. Each suture was a small knot tied by someone who had learned to fix human bodies when the nearest hospital was 8 hours away by convoy and the only available tools were what fit in a medical bag. The monitors showed normal rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The beautiful, ordinary sound of a heart beating the way hearts were supposed to beat. At 0445, she unlocked the ICU door. Dr. Pierce stood in the hallway with 5 security guards. He had been waiting. He had known she would defy him, and he had positioned himself accordingly, not to help, but to collect evidence. His phone was already in his hand. He had already made the calls. "I'm going to need you to step away from the patient," he said. His voice was quiet, certain, the voice of a man who had already won. I'm going to need you to surrender your badge. You are suspended effective immediately pending investigation by the State Licensing Board. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem that is already solving itself. His pressure is stable, she said. His oxygen is adequate. He's going to live. Not because of you, Pierce said. Despite you. You've just destroyed your nursing license. You've just committed a felony. The hospital's legal team is already on the way. Security is going to escort you from the building. You will not return without explicit authorization from hospital administration, and I can assure you that authorization will never come. The hallway was very quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn. Down the corridor, the night shift nurses were beginning to emerge from other rooms, drawn by the confrontation. Witnessing. Recording. Taking notes. Within the hour, everyone at St. Michael's would know that Natalie Hayes had locked a door and performed surgery and defied an attending physician and destroyed her career in the span of 47 minutes. Pierce stepped toward her. His hand reached for her arm, his expression certain. He had already decided how this story ended. He had already written it in conversations with board members and licensing investigators and the hospital's legal department. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened next would change everything, though neither Pierce nor Natalie could have predicted it, and the security guard standing in the hallway could never have expected what would arrive in 36 minutes when the hospital's security system would ping a classified Pentagon database, triggering an alert that would eventually bring people with authority so far above Pierce's that his medical degree would become almost quaint in comparison. For now, though, he stood in the hallway of St. Michael's ICU in Atlanta, Georgia, absolutely certain that he had won, that the quiet nurse in scrubs was finished, that hierarchy and liability and protocol mattered more than the impossible heartbeat of a man who should have been dead by 02:30 but was instead living because someone had remembered what it meant to be captain instead of just a nurse. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, each breath pushing oxygen into Captain Rhett's reconstructed thorax. Natalie stood motionless in the doorway of room 4, watching the numbers climb on the monitor behind him. Oxygen saturation rose in steady increments, 88, 91, 94, her hand still remembering the muscle memory that had taken over at 0200, the moment she'd locked the ICU door and retrieved the combat knife from her ankle sheath. The blade had moved through tissue with the same precision it once used in the dust and chaos of Baghdad, where she'd learned that anatomy didn't care about liability and protocol didn't keep people alive. Her hands had known exactly where to cut, exactly how deep, the pressure of each movement calibrated from 18 years of trauma surgery in war zones that no longer existed on any official record. The blood on her scrubs had already begun to dry, turning from bright red to rust. She'd worked for 2 hours and 45 minutes in surgical isolation, her forearms soaked past the elbows, Captain Rhett's aorta in her hands like a bird that might shatter if she breathed wrong. She'd used techniques from 2009, from Fallujah, from operating theaters without electricity or clean water or anyone to hand her instruments. She'd clamped the bleeding vessel with a technique that had saved 47 lives under mortar fire. She'd stabilized his heart without an open-heart surgical suite, using only her hands and her knife and the kind of certainty that only comes when you've already survived worse. His vitals had stabilized at 0 for 4-5. His daughter's name was in the system, Sarah, Major Sarah Rhett, Army Intelligence. She'd be arriving within hours. The hallway outside room 4 was still dark, the ICU humming with the quiet rhythm of mechanical ventilation and cardiac monitors in their steady digital conversations. Natalie stepped into the hallway and saw Dr. Pierce coming toward her like a man who'd just won something he'd never thought he could claim. His face was triumphant, his jaw tight with the kind of satisfaction that only victory against someone you despise can bring. Security was behind him, 2 officers with their hands resting on their belts, their faces professionally blank. "Surrender your badge," Pierce said. Not a question. A command. He held out his palm like a man accepting payment on a debt. Natalie unclipped it from her waistband without a word. The small rectangular ID, worn at the corners, with her name and photograph from 3 months ago, when she'd still been practicing the art of being invisible. She placed it in his palm, and when his fingers closed around it, she watched his face transform into something almost rapturous. He'd been waiting for this moment since the day she'd corrected his medication calculation in front of 2 residents. This was what he'd been building toward with every public dismissal, every calculated humiliation, every strategic conversation with people in positions that mattered. "You're suspended, pending full investigation," he said, his voice carrying the particular electricity of a man who'd just weaponized bureaucracy and won. "Security will escort you to HR. You'll surrender your access codes, your parking pass, everything. And then you'll get off this property before I have you arrested for practicing medicine without a license." She didn't respond. Her composure wasn't fragile, it was armor. Her hands hung steady at her sides, not trembling, not clenching. The blood on her scrubs told the truth that her face refused to acknowledge. One of the security officers gestured toward the elevator. She walked that direction with the same steady gait she'd used walking toward Black Hawk helicopters in the dark, the same pace that had carried her through hostile territory where hesitation meant death. The HR director's office was on the 3rd floor. It was 0500, and the woman who opened the door was still wearing sleep-creased clothes, summoned from home by a call from Dr. Pierce that had used words like security risk and unauthorized procedure. She took one look at Natalie, blood on her scrubs, blood on her hands, blood on the cuffs of her jacket, and her face went carefully neutral. "Your resignation is effective immediately," the director said. It wasn't a negotiation. Pierce had already called the hospital administrator, who had called the director, who had received a folder of documentation about a rogue nurse who'd broken every protocol and performed unauthorized surgery. The director held out a form. Natalie signed it. The pen moved across the page with absolute steadiness. She'd signed worse documents in her life, orders that had sent people into situations they didn't come home from, discharge papers for soldiers who'd never walk again. A resignation form required nothing. The hospital laundry was in the basement, accessed through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and industrial bleach, a combination that tightened something in her chest that she refused to acknowledge. At 0530, under fluorescent lights that buzzed with the particular exhaustion of being turned on all night, she removed her blood-stained scrubs. The fabric was still warm, still damp in places. She stood in front of the industrial sink and washed her hands, watching the water run from rust to pink to clear, and then she began to fold her scrubs. The fold was military. The crease was exact. She aligned the sleeves with the precision of someone who'd once folded flags for soldiers, each motion deliberate and measured and loaded with the kind of respect that only silence could express. The scrubs folded into thirds. Then halves. Then a rectangle small enough to fit in a palm. She placed it in the return bin, watching it disappear beneath a mountain of other used linens, and something that had been burning in her chest very quietly went cold. A laundry worker was sorting whites from colors, early shift starting at 0530. She watched Natalie work, watched her refold the top of her scrubs once more, getting the crease exactly right, and something in the woman's expression shifted, recognition of ritual, of finality, of a person performing the last rites of a life that had just ended. Natalie didn't look at her. She placed her badge access card on the counter beside the sink and walked out. Upstairs in HR, the hospital's routine background check system, upgraded just 3 weeks earlier to scan federal databases in real time, was processing Natalie Hayes' termination paperwork through a new algorithm that nobody had warned her about, that she'd never known existed. The system pinged against databases that were supposed to remain sealed, classified directories that didn't technically exist in any public record. It was looking for tax records and credit history and prior employment verification, and instead it found something else entirely. Access restricted. Contact DoD liaison. The HR director stared at her screen, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. The file was marked with a Pentagon seal. The clearance level was so high that it appeared as a black box in the system, information hidden even from the automated processing that was supposed to catalog every employee's background. She read the flag 3 times. Then she closed the file without printing it. Some things that appeared in hospital systems were mistakes. Some things existed in compartments that weren't meant to be opened. She would process the resignation and file the paperwork and forget that her screen had ever displayed those words. In the ICU, Dr. Pierce was celebrating. He'd called 2 board members at 0500, waking them with news that the rogue nurse had been suspended and was resigning effective immediately. He'd spoken with her nursing school to demand her transcripts, already building the narrative of an unstable practitioner who'd never been qualified for the position she'd held. He was drafting an incident report that would ensure she never worked in medicine again, never held a position of trust, never rehabilitated her reputation. By the time he finished, she would be professionally radioactive. The hospital would be protected. The liability would be eliminated. Order would be restored. In Room 4, Captain James Rhett's daughter had just landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International. Her name was Major Sarah Rhett, and she was Army intelligence, which meant she'd already been briefed on her father's condition and she already understood that the surgical technique used on his aorta was not something taught in civilian medical schools. It was field medicine. Combat medicine. The kind of intervention that only happened when someone was willing to break protocol because protocol meant death. The monitors showed his vitals stable, his oxygen saturation at 97%, his heart rate hovering at a disciplined 72. The incision was clean. The work was precise. Someone had saved his life, and someone had paid the price for that decision. She could see it in the way the nursing station was quiet, in the way people wouldn't meet her eyes when she asked who had performed the emergency thoracotomy. She could see it in the way security was stationed outside his room, as if the hospital was protecting him from something other than infection. She pulled out her phone and made a call to a number that connected to an office in the Pentagon that didn't have a listed directory. She used a name that wasn't her own. She stated the facts in the kind of neutral language that military intelligence officers used when they were about to move very large pieces across a very complex board. And then she sat beside her father's bed and waited for the helicopter rotors that she knew were coming, waited for the people who collected debts that had been outstanding since 2009, waited for the moment when the hospital would understand that some secrets were written in scar tissue and classified files, and some people who worked in scrubs carried authority that made generals nervous. The rain started at 0600, hammering the hospital roof like the percussion of something larger than weather. In the laundry room, Natalie Hayes sat on a folding chair under those relentless fluorescent lights, her hands folded in her lap, and let the weight of 18 years settle onto her shoulders. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining seemed to burn against her ribs, the symbol of a unit that officially hadn't existed for 8 years, a call sign that she'd buried so deep that sometimes she forgot it belonged to her. Valkyrie. The woman who'd retrieved fallen soldiers from impossible terrain. The woman who'd saved 47 lives in a theater of war. The woman who'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life so completely that even she'd begun to believe the lie. The system had pinging her classified file. The Pentagon would be reading that alert now, understanding that the digital tripwire they'd buried in their databases had just snapped. They would be making calls. They would be activating protocols that hadn't been used in 9 years. And she would sit here in the basement under these fluorescent lights and wait, because waiting was what soldiers did, because protocol and procedure and hierarchy meant nothing when someone was dying, because some oaths transcended uniforms and discharge orders and the comfortable fiction of being civilian. The ventilator in room 4 continued its mechanical breathing, keeping a Navy captain alive, kept alive by someone the hospital had just fired, kept alive by an act of devotion that had crossed every boundary that was supposed to separate soldiers from civilians, war from peace, the captain she'd been from the nurse she'd pretended to be. Captain Rhett's eyes opened in recovery like a man waking from a decade-long sleep. His hand moved first, searching, finding the fall line. Then his voice, barely a whisper, the sound of wind through ruins. Valkyrie. Just that. One word that shattered time itself. Natalie stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still raised from checking his monitor, and something inside her chest broke open like a door she'd sealed 17 years ago. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly who had held his life in her hands at 2 in the morning, who had cut through ribs and silence and protocol to bring him back. The footsteps came before she could move. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. A Marine Corps colonel entered, dress uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, eyes the color of winter Atlantic. Behind him, a file folder. Bronze. Gold lettering. She didn't need to read it to know what it contained. the inventory of her own erasure, her own resurrection. The colonel's voice carried the weight of mountains. For extraordinary heroism under fire, Captain Natalie Hayes led 12 combat rescues. A pause. Medical tape hummed against her wrist. Bronze Star. Another beat. She'd taught herself not to hear these words. They belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't folding laundry in hospital basements. Silver Star. The colonel's eyes found hers across the hospital bed. 2 purple hearts. His hand moved to the folder. And a Navy cross. The recovery room door exploded inward. Dr. Pierce stood in the frame like a man who'd been running, his white coat flapping, his voice a weapon. This is unauthorized. She performed surgery without consent, without supervision, without any right to. He stopped. Stopped mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-everything. Because a 2-star general stepped forward from the shadows where he'd been standing, and the general's hand rose in a salute so perfect it seemed to slow time itself. Not a casual gesture. Not a greeting. A recognition. A benediction. His arm raised toward Natalie's chest, toward the Navy unit patch pinned openly now, no longer hidden in jacket lining, where 2 purple hearts and a Navy cross caught the fluorescent light like small trapped suns. Pierce's face drained the way blood drains from a wound. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. He was looking at something he'd never trained to see, authority that didn't come from a stethoscope or a pedigree. Authority that came from having stood in the worst place a human could stand and chosen to stand for others. The general's voice came low and even. Operation Sandstorm. 2009 through 2012. Classified until 30 seconds ago. He turned to face the hospital board members who'd begun filing into the recovery room like mourners at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. A Pentagon liaison emerged behind them with a briefcase the color of gunmetal. He set it on a rolling table, opened it with a sound like a weapon being cocked, and pulled out documentation. Captain Hayes performed an unauthorized emergency thoracotomy. The alternative was a code blue that the hospital had deemed futile. 20 physicians refused intervention. His eyes moved across each board member. 90 seconds of explanation. By minute 91, Pierce had stopped being a problem. He'd stopped being anything at all. But that wasn't the worst part, not for him, anyway. The worst part was what happened when that video went live at 1400 hours. A nurse named Martinez had been standing at the vending machine 3 weeks earlier. She'd been filming a TikTok about the broken coffee machine when she caught something in the background. A doctor shoulder-checking a colleague. Threatening words. An act so casual and cruel it barely registered at the moment. But Martinez had kept the footage. Bored, maybe. Or angry. Or smart enough to know that someday it might matter. She posted it at 1,400 hours, 40 seconds of Dr. Pierce in his element, humiliating a woman standing perfectly still in scrubs. The caption simple. Clinical. Dr. Bully's decorated war hero. By 1,600 hours, the video had 2 million views. By 1,700, it was trending. The comments section filled with recognition, rage, grief. Stories from patients he'd dismissed. Stories from nurses he'd destroyed. Stories from medical students he'd called mediocre because they didn't have his connections, his family name, his breeding. Pierce's phone began ringing at 1,645 hours. A number he recognized. His medical school mentor. Dr. Richard Halloway, retired Navy physician, 73 years old, still volunteered at the VA. A man Pierce had bragged about, mentioned constantly, used as a credential. The conversation lasted 90 seconds because that's all Dr. Halloway needed. You humiliated a Navy Cross recipient. Halloway's voice carried the scrape of gravel and tobacco smoke. You're no student of mine. The line went dead. By 1,800 hours, Halloway had called the hospital board personally. By 1900, 3 board members who'd taken Pierce's calls earlier in the week were issuing statements about barely knowing him. Professional relationships, they called it. The loosest possible definition. The easiest possible escape. The state licensing board investigator Pierce had summoned to destroy Natalie now appeared with a different question. Patient abandonment. 20 physicians refusing to treat a critical case. Liability concerns overriding clinical judgment. By 2000 hours, Pierce was suspended pending investigation. By 2015, he was fired. By 2030, his lawyer sent an email. I cannot represent you in this matter. His hands shook in the darkness of his office as the view counter on Martinez's video climbed past 5 million. 6 months later, a security training instructor stood in a fluorescent-lit classroom in Marietta, Georgia, demonstrating CPR compressions on a plastic dummy. Dr. Pierce counted to 30. His voice mechanical. His hands empty of everything they'd once held. 15 teenagers in folding chairs, their eyes glazed with the particular pain of mandatory training. He'd sent out 47 resumes. 47 rejections. This community college job paid $15 an hour. He needed it in the way people need oxygen. A student scrolled through social media during the demonstration, and somewhere in the infinite scroll, there was still that video. Millions had watched it. Millions had moved on. Dr. Pierce kept counting. 1, 2, 3. The dummy received his attention the way patients never had. Across the city at St. Michael's ICU, Natalie Hayes entered through the main doors at 0630 hours on a Monday morning, and her unit patch was visible. Not hidden. Not apologetic. Sewn onto her uniform in the open, where everyone could see it. Where everyone would see it. Captain Rhett had been discharged for weeks after surgery, but he visited monthly now. Always the same time. Always the same floor. This particular Monday, he appeared at the ICU entrance at 06 for 5 hours, moving with the careful deliberation of a man rebuilding his relationship with his own body. When he passed room 4, now occupied by a post-surgical patient sleeping off anesthesia, he stopped. His hand rose to his temple. 2 fingers. A salute. Natalie was 3 feet away, updating a chart, and she didn't look up. She didn't have to. Her hand rose in mirror image. 2 fingers to her temple. A private language. A conversation only they could read. The new ICU director was Dr. Sarah Messier, former Army medic with 23 years of service and a disinterest in hierarchy that shook the hospital's foundations. She'd implemented a policy, combat medical experience counted toward clinical advancement. 3 combat medics had been hired in the month since. Residents now competed for Natalie's attention during breaks, asking about field protocols, about decisions made under fire, about the difference between textbook medicine and survival medicine. She rarely answered. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before her shift, other nurses would catch her touching the unit patch on her shoulder, not checking it, not adjusting it. Just touching it. The way people touch holy things. Like she was reminding herself that it was real. That she was real. That some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Someone had placed a plaque on her locker. Small. Brass. 3 letters engraved in military font, Valkyrie. She hadn't removed it. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've made it this far, you know there are people in your life right now, your workplace, your community, your hospital, carrying quiet strength you'll never recognize. They're not looking for credit. They're not looking for applause. They're looking for the space to do the work that matters. Subscribe to see more stories like Natalie's. Like stories about the ones we overlook until we have no choice but to see them. Comment below, who's the quiet hero you've underestimated?